So one of the biggest problems that folklorists have to contend with is the issue of authenticity. Why? Well, mostly because it's a word that people attach a lot of importance to, even though everybody has a different idea of what authenticity actually is. If your reaction to that sentence is something along the lines of, huh? Well, you're not alone. Anyone who's ever looked at any cultural tourism brochure ever has probably seen the word authentic used at least once. Corporations will drop words like authenticity all the time to sell anything from ethnic food, to tickets to cultural events, to souvenirs. And this isn't just an issue when it comes to tourism either. Folklorists have for a long time been very concerned with studying authentic cultural materials. Now the problem here is trying to figure out what exactly authenticity is, and also why we are so fixated on it. So in this video, we are going to define tourism as travel for the express purpose of experiencing the other. That is to say, something other than what you are used to experiencing, and that's usually culture in this case. And it's pretty much always done just for leisure. Culinary tourism is a little bit different though, because you don't usually have to travel as far to partake in it, or at all if the restaurant you order from delivers. As I mentioned earlier, authenticity is a tricky word to use in folklore studies because it gets tossed around a lot, and people put a lot of importance on having authentic experiences, but no one really knows what it means for something to be authentic, or inauthentic for that matter. You're probably thinking, what are you talking about? Everybody knows what it means for something to be authentic. Well, if that were really the case, would I be doing a video about it? Now, when most people think of authenticity, they tend to think of it as objective reality. Something is either real or it isn't. There is no in-between. In fact, Dean McCannell describes the modern tourist as somebody who is on a quest for authenticity in a world that is inherently inauthentic, with authenticity being something that comes from a pre-modern world with pre-modern people. So many air quotes. Air quotes for everybody! Sound familiar? Well, it should, especially if you've watched my previous videos on the history of folklore. This is pretty much the way early folklorists used to treat the people they studied, and as we know, it's not really an effective way of thinking about culture or the people who use it. Now, all people live in the present, unless they're Time Lords, and so all culture is therefore contemporary for the people who use it. This is the case even if there is historical precedent because, at least for folklorists, the way people use traditions now is just as important as the way they used to use them in the past. Therefore, a tourist who makes a point of seeking out an authentic experience, that is to say pre-modern, simply aren't going to find it, unless they're a Time Lord. Nevertheless, authenticity is still a thing that we search for. So, in order to find it, we then have to construct an idea of what authenticity is supposed to be and then act it out. And this isn't just done by tourists either, but by the people the tourists are traveling to see. The way we perform, there's that word again, can be pretty well summed up by Erving Goffman's theory of social performance. Shout out to sociology peeps! Let's go to the whiteboard for this next bit. Basically, Goffman argues that you can divide the social world into front and back spaces, like the front and backstage areas of a theater. Backstage areas are off limits to anyone without a pass, which basically means people from outside of the culture in this context. The backstage areas where people prepare for their performances, store props, and take breaks from performing. In short, the cultural context on which people actually live. The front stage is where performances actually take place, in front of other people, many of whom are from outside of the culture and so aren't privy to the goings-on backstage. Restaurants are a good example. The dining room is the main front stage, and the kitchen, being separated from and out of sight of the customers, is the backstage. Now, McCannell added a middle stage that he refers to as staged authenticity. The front stage is inauthentic, the backstage is where the real authenticity can be found, but the levels of authenticity can vary in the middle ground depending on how close to the front or back they are. Folklore is just really like spectrums, okay? So just to recap, the backstage is where people actually live their everyday lives, while the front stage is only made to look like it's the backstage. Middle stage is, well, in the middle. Because front stages are only presented as if they're the backstage regions, they can never really be truly authentic. In fact, they're specifically designed to trick tourists into thinking that they are authentic. Ethnic restaurants in particular use a bunch of different strategies to create the appearance of authenticity. The design and content of the menu, the descriptions of the food, and the decor of the restaurant are just a few examples. These are strategies that are actively used by the proprietors of the restaurant based on what they think the diners think is authentic. And of course, the diners at the ethnic restaurant have their own criteria by which they judge authenticity. These criteria are usually based on their own social experience. Most of the people eating at ethnic restaurants don't actually have the experience of traveling to the country where that food originates. But those who do will usually use that experience to judge restaurants back home. Some diners might use the spiciness of the food or even the ethnicity of the restaurant staff to judge authenticity. Now, the way I talk about authenticity probably seems pretty negative, especially to those of you who haven't been exposed to these issues before. Granted, it can be pretty disenchanting enchanting, but it doesn't have to be all bad. The important thing to remember is that because food is such an important part of how we construct and express identity, going out to eat at so-called exotic restaurants is an active effort to experience the identities of other people. The attractiveness of having an authentic experience is basically born from the desire to understand each other. That's not so bad, right? The thing about being an academic in any field, though, is that you have to be able to consider all possible sides of a story in order to get information that is as objective and unbiased as possible. For folklorists, romanticizing ideas that we might think are authentic but are not actually true to life can be a hindrance to learning new things. Now, these are really complicated arguments that we are probably going to keep coming back to again and again over the course of this series. But now that we're 7 videos in, I hope you've come to expect that. I could probably go on, but I'm gonna stop here for now. This has been an episode of the Folklore Tree. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.